Clarity by Dragonson, Chapter 12, Found. What exactly are you doing? Ruby blinked before realizing Naruto had asked her a question. She looked over at the boy as he continued the kata uninterrupted, the same he had been doing for the past 2 weeks since they fell into the forest. With all that had changed, a part of her couldn't help but feel like it had been longer than that. At the beginning they had been at each other's throats, and neither lowering their guards physically or mentally, or even for even a second. Then, through the necessity or desire, they had stumbled into a routine that hinged around staying away from each other for as long as possible and keeping to their own strengths. Finally, at last, they had a real heart-to-heart. At least that's what Ruby assumed. And now, you've been tinkering with the scroll since we arrived. The blonde stepped into a sidekick, leg mechanically flat like an action figure. I was under the impression it didn't work. It doesn't, the stranded girl admitted, but there's not much else to do, so I thought to see if I could make something out of it. Like what? He asked, falling into another too perfect stance that had been smoothed through repetition into a fine polish. I don't know. Ruby shrugged as she detached the screen and rearranged the circuitry for the umpteenth time. Maybe a bazooka or something? That made the blonde pause, aiming an open hand punch and falter into the lower sweep. He craned his neck within the awkward crouch he found himself in and over to the red-cloaked girl. A bazooka? Yep. Like the assassin, she didn't even pause in her fiddling to give the quip. You want to take apart the scroll and turn it into a bazooka. Unlike the kata, his lips struggled to form the sounds of the question and made it come out like a statement. Ruby looked up at him, and he was nearly bowled over by the radiating glow in her eyes. Bazookas are awesome! All her enthusiasm locked within the star-spangled stare. She was able to keep the statement to a level volume as she learned her companion didn't appreciate the noise. He did, but Earthwhile had no response. Unable to think of one, he simply went back to his kata and left the girl to her device. Want to help? She asked after a moment more, tinkering absently. Could be fun, she emphasized, snickering to herself at the concept. When had she started teasing him? I have to hunt, Naruto pointed out, though without making a break in his resumed form. No, you don't, Ruby countered, holding a small screwdriver aloft for emphasis. We still have the fish, remember? Ah, he had forgotten. That in itself was strange, though he could not rationalize it with the fact that every day seemed the same, and he was without missions or practice uh, or to orchestrate his time. The far more troubling issue was that he'd found himself waking up late. Come on. Bored herself to the solitary activity, Ruby entertained the entre- entreated the boy to join her. It's not like you have anything better to do. Though he wanted to, he could not deny her statement, making no intent of moving to walk towards her as he was still in the middle of his kata. He nonetheless gave a quiet nod of consent and hoped it would suffice. Ruby hummed happily as she continued working with the little device for a few more moments, which would hopefully be the last one. With the solo activity passing the time as it always did, it seemed to be only seconds later she felt the dean sit next to her without looking up from the scattered sets of parts. How should I help? Hand me the metal plate there. Without her needing to specify, Naruto found the small item and obliged with a hand that was as steady as it had been during the forms. He watched as she took the postage stamp sized plate and inserted it into a slot, beginning to twist it carefully clockwise. Wooden log, please. Unflinchingly, Naruto handed her the block and she began lightly peeling the edge. peeling the edge, trying to bend the case back into shape without harming the puzzle of electronics she'd assembled inside. Next comes the wires. Huffing to herself, the silver-eyed girl began fiddling with something the young assassin couldn't see behind her spider-like hands. "You seem to enjoy this." Even though he wasn't doing much, Naruto could remark from his newfound perspective next to the girl. He found he was equally fascinated with her apparent skill, as he was her single-minded needed to assemble and disassemble. "Yeah, it's great. I always love doing this," Ruby chirped in routine, her chipper voice coming to sound more and more like the gay bird songs which serenaded them throughout the day. "And I'm glad you're helping me." "You're optimistic for someone stranded with an enemy." Less enthused than her, Naruto was also less encouraged with this observation as he didn't know how to qualify it. He was still her enemy and now doing nothing much to help her, yet she was still glad as well. "Gotta learn to look at the bright side," she responded, hesitant in a quarter turn counterclockwise of an almost invisible screw. "I just what?" Nato asked, unsure when he had gotten so curious about her personal woes. "I just wish I still had my sigil." Removing the tiny tool, Ruby sighed as she looked down at her belt. After stripping her clothes from her first bath, she had noticed the emblem had been missing. Most likely it had fallen off when the two of them had fought after they landed, or perhaps during the fall. "Your sigil?" Nato questioned, unsure of the significance. The assassins had hallmarks, calling cards, certain modus operandi, but nothing to identify them individually. "Yeah," she answered distractedly, not understanding his incomprehension. "It was part of a set." "I see." Still clearly not. He had learned this phrase often placated the girl regardless. "It's fine." She waved off, though her heart had not been in the answer, and she wasn't sure her companion understood that either. Well, at least she still had her squirrel to tinker with. That is, until the device began sparking like crazy. With a small eep, the misplaced R of Ruby tossed the device away in shock, while Naruto recoiled defensively. The two of them watched as it flared and fizzled before dying a moment later. "I don't think that was supposed to happen." Naruto turned to face her companion, who was mere inches away from her. Whether it was the distance or the circumstance, she could actually see a spark of curiosity in his normally void blue eyes. She couldn't help herself as she began laughing. "You could be right," Ruby giggled freely, plenty used to having things combust on her watch, but not so accustomed to the spectators. "It was a nice change. There was a world steeped in sin. Mankind's every lofty ideal had its roots deep in death and deceit, such that when it grew to fruition, it was stained like the white rose, red with blood. No amount of tearful regret could wash away this plight, yet hopes and flowers still reach for the sky. Therefore, like she'd been shoveled atop a garden, there was no greater sin than the old outliving the young. Out of all the atrocities that Sarutobi had committed in the name of a better future, this was the one he most regretted, because what would it all have been for, if not the next generation? The roots of the tree supported its branches and leaves, knowing that someday they would fall and fertilize the ground again, but not without showing their true colors. Oh, such aspiring hopes nipped in the bud before they even had a chance. No, the old shadow sighed and set down his pen, rubbing his eyes, which were seeing lines on paper like veins in leaves, or blackened veins of bloated corpses. Black curtains of fatigue like locusts nipped away at the edge of sanity. He was getting too old for this shit. He had buried too many youths, including his own son and his successor, and now he feared for the next generation. But hope was not lost just yet. It was just getting harder to find on the uninspiring walls of his office. Earthen tones reminded him too much of a grave he now longed for, the spot that kept getting filled by friends and family, standing with the same resolves he used to justify his inevitable job and difficult decisions. Saratobi decided he needed another reminder of why he accepted the position again. He quit his chair and office with an alacrity that decried his old age, flying through the doors and underneath the notice of his studious secretary, who did not so much as glance up from her own duties. Only once he was in the house could he remember his leisure, redoubling the calm bearing and grandfatherly demeanor that assured his subordinates of a purpose and plan which would make their sacrifices worthwhile. He only wished that he could convince himself the same, unwavering, unquestioning. If there was one thing Naruto's emotionless manner was good for, it was this: being a constant in a world which was always changing. He was the embodiment of conviction, even if he himself was not always cognizant of his own role in the grand scheme of things. Perhaps that was part of the problem. Sarutobi had wanted him to have a normal life as possible, when their profession clearly defied normalcy. Teaching children to kill from a young age was supposed to give them an appreciation for life, but how could they understand that which they never had? He had fought long and hard to retrieve the boy from the clutches of someone who wanted to use him as nothing more than a living weapon, only to then place him right back in the thick of things, somehow hoping the other equally damaged children would help instill some stability, if not normalcy. If anything, the opposite seemed to be true. Now that Naruto was gone, it was as if buckles to the straitjacket had been loosened, and the cute little head cases were becoming a danger to themselves and others. Not the others they wanted them to, though. Team 7 couldn't go on any missions with their missing member, which was making them a bit stir-crazy. At the same time, they made it a point to not stray outside their barracks or the dojo, keeping to themselves and their training. And even if they wanted to, Sarutobi didn't think it wise to let them loose with the lot at each other's throats. Talk about teens unable to manage emotions. None of them understood how their shared sense of blame caused them to alienate one another. Not to mention their taciturn behavior also estranged the other assassins, with Team Shiva being the most noticeably rebuffed, which was a shame because Nila and the rest were almost as affected by the loss. Their guilt for being gone on another mission at the time was only compounded by the fact that Kasai now wouldn't let them come close enough to offer condolences. Foolish brats! It was all Sarutobi's fault in the first place for not noticing sooner that their so-called head of intelligence was making seemingly stupid decisions. It was his fault for letting Naruto fall into their hands to begin with. It was his fault for letting things get so fucked up and now not knowing how to fix it. Not knowing what to do, or even what he was doing, Sarutobi chomped on the edge of his pipe he had unwittingly stuffed into his mouth. The worst part was that he didn't even have time to be morose about his missing subordinate. Rather, dealing with the fallout of the failed mission took priority. He still had the rest of an organization to run. Word spread quickly despite the assassin's secretive nature. The latest rumor said that the North Branch was sending that man to find out what was going on, probably hoping to find weaknesses in the Kage's leadership. While Sarutobi himself was still strong enough to take on the best warriors the others had to offer, the danger wasn't with infighting, or rather fighting at all. Oh no, this latest missing mission proved that intelligence was what won or lost battles, and what was missing this another assassin had in spades. Their agents had the uncanny ability to read people like Burrow within shadow. Speaking of shadows, the current Kage couldn't afford to have Itachi or Kakashi deployed for much longer. They had been hanging around Huntsman hotspots, hoping for leads on their missing member, but the longer they did that, the more they risked exposing themselves and the organization, not to mention taking time away from paying jobs. Honestly, Saratobi himself didn't even really have time to visit with the teens, but his sanity was being strained by doing nothing but the damage control, and right now he needed to be reminded what he was fighting for, at least before he lost it entirely and crashed. It was a testament to just how tired he was that he nearly crashed into a dark blur that was making its way opposite him in the halls, rather nearly barreled into him in its single-minded drive to get wherever it was going, but he was not the head of all assassins for nothing, and swiftly caught both himself and the offender before any damage could be done. Hey, let me go. I need to. Kage-sama? The lithe body quickly fell from his grip and dropped into a low bow, kissing the floor. Saratobi was taken aback by the change in attitude, which was almost as fast as the body running through the halls. That and the sheer coincidence meant that he didn't recognize who it was at first. Nila, my dear girl, what luck it is running into you. Well, nearly so. With a gentle chuckle and hand, he bid her rise, since her face was flat against the floor and all flavors of embarrassment. Not that I'm displeased to see you, but what is the rush? Kage-sama, she breathed out with relief and elation. I was actually coming to see you. Oh? He then tried to usher her to a place where they could both sit down, but this time the young assassin did not defer to his rank or old age, and insisted on standing her ground. He overlooked this breach of decorum because he could see the seriousness on her face. What about? I think I have found Naruto. Staggered by this simple declaration, Sarutobi now wished he had a chair, but he wasn't that old, so it only took a second before the feeling passed and one of decisive action overcame his bones. Where? While it was unlikely this junior assassin had revealed where days of veteran soldiers combined combing the forest had yielded nothing, the Kage had to remind himself this shadow in particular was not your average teenage girl. Pride that was unbecoming of a killer crossed her face when she realized he believed her, but Saratobi could let that slide considering he was probably just as much, if not more, elated. But as she opened her cherry lips that were chafed and faded from weeks of neglect, a much gruffer voice had a much voice than expected startled them both. Mila, there you are! Setting a good pace for his trot frame, Forever came jogging down the hallway, followed by an irate Nolonan. But really, when was the androgynous teen not sour? We've been looking everywhere for you. I thought we locked you in the room and told you to get some sleep. A combination of defensive and disgruntled, the captain turned halfway back to her approaching team, and Sarutobi could finally see the bags under her eyes. They were as black as her unkempt hair, which had lost its usual gloss and gave off an unwashed odor. Underneath a mask of perfume, giving her a quick assessment, Sarutobi had overlooked the fact that she had not slept in weeks, likely ever since Naruto disappeared. Sorry, she apologized demurely, but I told you this was something I need to do. The change in tone hit Ferrer like a shockwave, and he came to a skidding halt. Even Saratobi recognized the dangerous inflection in her voice and took a halfway step back from the volatile woman. More importantly, I think I've been able to pinpoint where Naruto landed to within a square kilometer. That is indeed wonderful, my girl. Saratobi treaded carefully, remembering that Nila wasn't the most stable of people under normal circumstances. This mental flexibility making her a prime candidate for captain and assassin, but also for chief case study at a mental ward. But your health is just as important as everyone else's, and your teammates seem concerned that you have not gotten enough sleep lately. I assume that you have already rechecked your own work. Of course. She snapped up but broke when she realized whom she was talking to. All but cowering behind the sheaf of scribbled notes she clutched in her hands like a shield. I mean, I did my best, and I'm pretty sure I got everything. Kage-sama, please don't indulge her. Looking like she'd been kept up all night as well. Lonan rolled her olive black eyes and even thought the better of it as they almost got stuck in her shaved head. As she woke up in the middle of the night last week saying the same thing only to realize a few hours later she neglected wind speed, the velocity variance of wind gusts for tropical storms in the northern hemisphere. Nella recited flatly to the tomboy who clearly didn't care. Not wind speed, but yes, we have included that now, along with several other variables we admiredly neglected. You see, she's talking nonsense. Oh, what the fuck, woman? Quit. Let the captain speak. From out of nowhere came China's reprimand and splendidly arms which struck Lonan in the back of the head like a whip. Sarutobi himself would be chagrined to note that he hadn't noticed her either until just then. Always a sober and experienced considering the mantle-born teenager towered over most everyone in the building, but now was not the time for that. Captain, may I see your notes? Having indulged in his subordinate for long enough, the Shadow stepped back in his robes and persona of absolute commander. He took the haphazard stack of pages as if they were a report of the utmost procedure and urgency, quickly scanning the caffeine-addled scrawl as it meandered through the page. The writing spilled over the margins, forcing him to turn the papers upside down, backwards, holding them individually up towards the ceiling so that the fluorescent lights could shine through. Saratobi scratched his head at a few points, but assumed that the girl had done her extracurricular homework. Team Shiva waited prostrate, the same as they would in the mission room. They were indifferent to the passerby, who either scooted around the gathering with sketched bows to their leader and confused looks to the team, or else avoided that corridor entirely as no man's land for the duration of the impromptu meeting. I see, Sarutobi said at last, causing the team to sneak looks at one another in confusion. Securing the sheets underneath his arm, the shadow of shadows did something unprecedented and lowered himself to the young captain. The hand he placed on her shoulder had taken more lives than ever offered congratulations, but this did nothing to debate the action. Thank you, Captain. Fighting against the age again, he smiled. You must have worked very hard on compiling this. I can only imagine the devotion you must have to your comrades and fellow captain. Thank you, Kage-sama. The young woman blushed so that her dark skin was almost as red as her eyes. The truth, the truth is, we really appreciate, respect, la, la, care for Naruto, and within those eyes there was conflict, shades of the same emotion fighting to explain themselves. He knows what it's like to not always be the one in control. Make sure he knows that next time you get a chance, giving the girl's shoulder a squeeze that was as soft as her confession. Sarutobi was glad that there were so many people besides himself that wanted the boy back for more than just sense of security. I wish half my subordinates were as devoted as you and your team are to one another, but you know that they have a right to worry if their leader isn't getting enough rest. You haven't slept in days, have you? We slept in shifts, Anila protested softly, hoping that her Kage would assume she meant with her team. The truth was more tangled than her knotted hair, and she winced, running a hand through it while the other conscious in her head conferred. The tightening of her jaw turned to resolution as the softness in her eyes stilled. Nothing we are not used to. Team Shiva is still ready for a retrieval mission awaiting your orders, sir. I'm sure you are. And with that, the captain of Team Shiva collapsed under Sarutobi's hand. which formed a chop at the back of her neck. He then shifted it underneath to cradle the young woman as a father would his child. However, Team Shiva's captain is currently incapacitated and I have no substitute to impose on your cell. It looks like Kakashi and Itachi will have to stay out in the field just a little bit longer. Kage-sama, somewhat alarmed at the oft-times upfront Pharaoh didn't understand why their leader knocked out their captain, even if he thought about doing it himself. Uma, your team's leave has been extended for a few days. Try to make the best of it. As wordless as the young man was now, Charna glided over and took Nila from their kage. She hoisted the significantly smaller woman over her shoulder like she was nothing but a bag of dead leaves, bowing her head imperceptibly in thanks. And make sure your captain stays in her room this time. I can't have my subordinates wandering around unaccounted for. Hi, Kage-sama. And with that, the team disappeared into the black of their nicknames. Only a fleeting fucking finally from Lonan marked their departure. I see, Saito repeated to the now empty hall, looking instead to the page filled halfway with the speculations. So, you assume he's with the young huntress, huh? Makes sense why we couldn't find him. A smile replacing the unlit pipe in his mouth, the wizened leader turned around and made his way back to his office with renewed purpose, not even concerned with the stack of paperwork which awaited him and those which would precipitate from his next orders. I'm sorry to cut your vacation short, but it's time to bring you home, Naruto.